All right, so in this video, we've got our event system working. It is correctly showing our contextual messages, and they go away after the duration, but I want to polish it up a little bit. And there's two kind of things that we're going to do. So first is improve the quality of life for our designers a little bit. So the designer is dealing with these little messages in here, and what if they wanted to type like an even longer message, like a book that is really long. So you can see this becomes a pain to deal with in this tiny little message box because you can't read it all. It's difficult to understand exactly what's happening there. So there's a neat a neat attribute we can add to our contextual message trigger to make that more usable. And so that is just called text area. So we're dealing with the message serialized field here. I'm just going to add another attribute. So attributes are basically things inside of the square brackets here. And this one is called text area. And what it's going to do is just create a larger editable text field in the inspector there. And you can give it some, if you want, you can specify like how many minimum and maximum lines there are. So there will be 3 lines, and then after 5, it will start to show a scroll bar. I just made those numbers up. I'm fine with magic numbers here. This is very trivial and it can only be used very specifically. So this is one of the few spots where I'd be okay with magic numbers. So we can save that and we can go take a look at what's going to change in here. And now you see our message box has 3 lines. And if I go longer than 3, it expands until I get to 5, in which case we get the scroll bar there. So that's nice if you're needing to deal with, longer text. All right, so that's easy. I mean, probably we can just make that a super simple, I did save. All right, we can make this a super simple commit real quick. It's a good idea because this next thing we're going to do is totally unrelated to this, so it's worth separating them in commits. Okay. Now, next up is like if I walk into this thing. So if I walk into this, and then I walk into this one, I'm trying to see like, it gets a little wonky like if you start stacking up coroutines. So that's an issue. Is like if the current coroutine is like getting ready to end, even though I just walked into it again, it's not going to give me like a fresh 5 seconds, which is kind of buggy. And the other thing is it's just like vanishing, and we could make that more polished by fading it away, which is going to give us a decent example of things you can do in coroutines. So let's try and fix that. So the first problem is probably the worst problem. It's really easy to fix. Well, it is and it isn't. So if we look at how our coroutine is happening and our event handler is happening, is every time the event happens, we're starting a new coroutine. And so we're going to create more and more of these coroutines if the player keeps walking into the trigger. And so it's going to like, each one is on its separate thread counting down before it turns the thing off. So the one, like if we start one and it's got 5 seconds going, and then we leave the trigger and we go in again, like 2 seconds later. So this one should have like 2 seconds before it's going to turn off. but we just walked in and started a new one that should have 5 seconds remaining. Well, what's going to happen is, even though the new one should have 5 seconds remaining, as soon as the 2 seconds go by from the original one, it's going to turn it off and basically cancel our previous or our more recent one. So that's problematic. And the best way to set that up would be with some sort of like queue system. But I think that's out of scope for this particular video. But what we could do that's simple and not really the worst solution is to just simply stop the previous coroutine before we start the new one. So when you walk into, when the message is triggered, why don't we stop all the coroutines that are dealing that this particular message controller is dealing with, and then start our new one. So the old message will stop and the new one will start. Instead of like layering and stacking up lots of different coroutines that are going to kind of fight with one another. So that'll fix one of the basic problems. And then the next thing is we could polish how it disappears. So why don't I make a serialized field here for something called a fade duration. And we'll make this message fade away. So it'll be a float, and we will call it fade out duration. And it's just going to be how long it takes to fade out. And this is separate from the regular message duration, because the message duration is like how long it's going to just be present. And then after it's present for that amount of time, it will fade out for however long our fade duration is. So it'll take, like, if we make this 1 second, which we can give it a default, we can make it 1. Then it'll fade out over the course of a second. And after a second, it'll be totally invisible. All right. So how do we do that in our coroutine here? So first of all, we don't want to even start fading until we've waited for the duration here, right? But then rather than just instantly turning it off, we will start fading out. So we can make a little comment that says start fading out. And so one of the neat things you can do in a coroutine is use a while loop. And this is like one of the only times you can use a while loop in Unity. If you don't know, so what I did right there is like called a code snippet in Visual Studio. So if you get your while there and you hit tab, it will flesh it out, which is actually even better for for loops because that syntax is just even longer. But the tab shortcut for what's called code snippets is pretty useful. All right. So normally in Unity, like this will just crash your game. But what we could do in a coroutine is type in yield return, and instead of a timer here, we can just say yield return null, which just will allow the game to break out of this while loop so that it can update all of the other game objects, and then it'll come right back inside of this while loop. So this while loop is kind of only governing this coroutine. It's not freezing up our entire game. It would freeze up our entire game if we don't tell it when it can yield and let the rest of the game do its thing. So that's why you need to make sure you have a yield inside of your while loop, and it can only be used in a coroutine. So we don't want this to happen forever. We want it to happen for as long as our message is, as long as our fade time hasn't been longer than the fade out duration. So we need to keep track of how long things have been going. So we'll make just a local variable here called elapsed time. Oops. And I guess we can start it at 0, because at this point it will have been 0. And this elapsed time is strictly meant to be elapsed time since we started trying to fade out. And then we also need to know when the fading started. So we can call this fade start time. I guess maybe this is more clear if I called it like fade elapsed time, so you don't get it confused with just general elapsed time since we've been in this coroutine. And so the fade start time is just going to equal time.time. So whatever time it is when we hit this line of code, because this will be after we've waited for the duration, and then we'll start fading here. All right, and so each, so first of all, now we can say, how long do we want to be in this while loop? Well, we want to be in it until the fade elapsed time is, while it's less than the fade duration. And so while the fade elapsed time is less than the fade duration, we will do whatever's happening in here, which is basically going to be incrementally reducing the alpha from 1 to 0 instead of just doing it in one big snap. And so the first thing we need to do inside of the while loop, so each time we're in the while loop, we need to make sure we're updating the elapsed time. So the fade elapsed time is going to equal whatever time it is right now minus the start time. So that'll give us a current concept of how much time has elapsed since we started fading. Because we can't, you can't use time.delta time so reliably inside of an IEnumerator because it's not really connected to frames. It's just its own little IEnumerator thing. So this is an easier or a more reliable way to understand elapsed time when you're inside of a coroutine. And so next we need to do whatever it is we're doing to fade the alpha out. So what I'm going to do is say canvas group.alpha equals, so 1 would be totally opaque and 0 would be totally invisible. So we're going to say it equals 1 minus the elapsed time divided by the duration. And so this way, when the elapsed time equals the duration, so if the duration is 1 and 1 second has gone by, 1 divided by 1 is 1, and 1 minus 1 is 0, so the alpha will be 0. And just in case, we don't know how, we don't know how often this is gonna get, this code will get executed in this while loop. So just in case the elapsed time, we break out of the while loop before it has actually gotten exactly to 0 on this next line outside of the while loop, we'll go ahead and make sure it gets set to 0, because it could get set pretty close to 0 but not exactly 0. So as soon as the while loop condition is not true anymore, we want to just go ahead and definitely set the canvas group alpha to 0. So this should give us kind of a nicer fade effect. I'll save it and give it a shot. And also we fixed that issue where stacking coroutines made it so that we may not see our message for the actual duration that we're supposed to. And then we see the nice little fade out. And so at this point, if I walk out and I walk back in, I know every time I trigger this, it's going to definitely be up there for 5 fresh seconds, or whatever the duration is that I set. Whereas before, they could start cutting each other off. If I walk in here, it's going to interrupt the previous one. It'll stop the old one and start the new one, which I think is desirable. We want the most recent message to be what shows up. All right, so this is pretty decent. I mean, the point isn't to like make this the greatest system ever. It's to show you how to use events and coroutines. So hopefully we succeeded. Sorry if I confused you. I'll see you all in the next video series. Oh wait, one last thing. I lied. I'm probably gonna make, well, so we need to open a pull request. I'll do that in the next video. But before I do, let's go ahead and make this commit. So we'll just say we added, fade out, and yeah, that's good enough. Okay, so I'll make one more video here to deal with. Remember, we're on this other branch. I'll make one more video to deal with how to open a pull request.